Okay, so two things. First of all, probably make yourself comfortable because I think we're going to be here for a while. And second of all, I tried my best to collect this information to try and make it as easy to understand as possible. So hopefully I don't lose you guys because there is a ton of information, but I tried my best and I guess we'll see how I do. David Anthony Burke, otherwise known as singer-songwriter David, is facing first-degree murder, continuous of a child under the age of 14 and unlawful mutilation of human remains charges on connection to the tragic brutal death of 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez, whose remains were found back in September of 2025. The prosecution is also pursuing special circumstances. One of those special circumstances in this case is murder for financial gain. And what that means is that if convicted on first-degree murder for financial gain, David Anthony Burke could potentially be facing the death penalty. The preliminary hearing for this case took place all of last week, beginning Monday, July 21st and ending just yesterday, Monday, July 28th. And as you guys know, because we have talked about this before, the point of a preliminary hearing is just to determine whether or not there is sufficient evidence for a case to proceed to trial. So it's either concluded that yes, there is, or no, there isn't. We now know that a judge ruled that yes, there is. So this case is now officially going to proceed to trial. David has pleaded not guilty to all three charges, and as of today, no trial date has been set. However, apart from ruling that this is going to go to trial, a preliminary hearing also gives us a better idea of what we can expect to come from both sides, the prosecution and the defense. So we're going to break that down, and I'm going to tell you the new information that came to light last week. And again, I tried my best to format this in a way that's hopefully not confusing. So the first day of the preliminary hearing begins, and David is brought into the courtroom. He's looking like a completely different version of him than the public is used to seeing. He was described to have been looking disheveled, unshaven, overall just not as well groomed or put together as he usually has been in the past. He's wearing the orange jumpsuit. He's sitting at the defense table with his attorneys, and the judge allowed for his handcuffs to be removed, but ruled that he would have to keep his waist and his feet shackled. A criminalist who is an LAPD staff member also testified that booking photos revealed that David did have, or rather does have, a tattoo of the name Celeste on his left ring finger. And his overall demeanor in the courtroom was described to be calm and largely expressionless throughout the proceedings. There were certain times throughout the hearings that he did seem to perk up a little bit more, pay closer attention, and look a little bit more focused, but overall he really showed no visible reaction through a lot of it, most of it. Celeste's parents were also in the courtroom at the times in which they could be, and I say that because at some points they did choose to step out or not attend at all during certain times when it was just too much for them to handle. For example, at times when the medical examiner testified and when graphic autopsy photographs were shown, her parents made the decision to step out because it was too hard for them to have to sit there and look at that. So the prosecution believes that Celeste's death was premeditated and a motive-driven murder. Prosecutors alleged that David killed Celeste after she threatened to expose details about the relationship before the release of his album, which would have damaged his lucrative career as a rising music star. Because Celeste was underage, the two of them were romantically involved, and they believed that David knew that, and that he knew that if Celeste was to expose their relationship, his career would be over. Remember, she was 14 years old at the time of her death, and David was 21 years old at the time of his arrest in April of 2026. So that is what the prosecution is going to argue in court, that David had a motive, which was protecting his career, and that he murdered Celeste to stop her from ruining his career. We're going to go into details on this later, but they believe that David and Celeste got in an argument allegedly about David's relationship with other women before David then sent a car to go and pick her up from her hometown of Lake Elsinore in California, which was around 80 miles away from his house in LA. The two of them were allegedly exchanging messages until she arrived at his house, and then her phone went dead. That's when prosecutors believe that he fatally stabbed her. Then, in the weeks that followed, they argue that David dismembered her body by placing her body in an inflatable pool in which he cut off her limbs and ultimately got rid of her remains by stuffing them into a large black zippered body bag and inside of his Tesla's trunk. And to prove that, they are building their case around several different things, one being the physical evidence, which is DNA taken from blood found at his home, in his garage, on mats on the floor, on garbage bags, on a crumbled up tarp, on the blue inflatable pool, in the back of the trunk, and on the third row seat of his car. That was all a match to Celeste. Then there's the overwhelming odor inside of his Tesla, multiple air fresheners placed inside of the car to cover up that smell, 11 air fresheners to be exact, a receipt showing a purchase of a shovel the day after the murder is believed to have occurred, and the biggest physical evidence, of course, being Celeste's dismembered body found in the trunk of his car. 2, you have the premeditation evidence, so the chainsaws and a burn box purchased under fake names on Amazon, suggesting that David planned the disposal of her body in advance rather than acting in a moment of impulse. 3rd, the digital evidence, explicit text messages between David and Celeste, including messages from the night that prosecutors believe that she was killed, and explicit images found on his phone. That digital evidence is part of what they're also going to be using to help them lay out a relationship timeline, because they really want the jury to understand that David was aware of the fact that Celeste was 14 years old, and to then explain how this quote-unquote relationship progressed to a point in which David felt like she could have ruined his career if she was to expose the details of the relationship, because the relationship, if you can even call it that, would be illegal under California law on multiple grounds. Not only because the age of consent in California is 18 years old and she was 14, but also because under California law, any physical relationship between an adult and a child immediately falls into child SA. Even if there is consent from both parties, legally speaking, that would be enough for a child SA charge. In the hearing, prosecutors also laid out a years-long account of interactions between David and Celeste. They argued that David met Celeste when she was only 11 years old and then began a physical relationship with her when she was at least 13 years old, but maybe even 12. The details of this age gap are important for a lot of reasons, not only because they support what they are saying was his motive, but also because they are the direct cause for one of his charges, which is continuous SA of a child under the age of 14. Okay, so then on the other side, you have the defense. David's defense team is maintaining his innocence, claiming that no physical witnesses or security cameras captured Celeste entering David's house on the night that she was presumably murdered. They're also going to be arguing that her family, her parents, were aware of this relationship and they were aware of the age gap. And they are going to argue that the text messages only demonstrate a jealous dispute rather than a homicidal motive. Finally, from the hearing, it also sounds like the defense is going to aggressively challenge the prosecution's evidence handling. So the defense is not saying that David and Celeste did not know each other, but their argument is based more so on challenging what kind of relationship they had, as well as the alleged motive and the strength of the physical evidence linking him to the specific act of ending her life. So as far as what kind of relationship they had, in the hearing, a detective by the name of Corey Farrell testified that their relationship was very much physical. That detective spent some time on the stand describing photograph after photograph of what investigators believe to be David performing certain acts on Celeste. There were allegedly more than 36 photos of the two of them that, quote, could not be shown in court because they depicted explicit SA. So they were too graphic to be shown, which is why the police detective described them one by one. And during that, Celeste's mom began crying and her father was just looking down to the ground. Then a deputy district attorney went over to the mom to try and comfort her, and then both of her parents got up and left the room. That detective also described text messages between them in which they talked about birth control, pregnancy, and terminating a pregnancy when Celeste would have been 13 years old and David would have been 19 years old. From those messages, we now know that Celeste had been pregnant and had terminated a pregnancy throughout the time that they were together. And more than a year before she was killed, there were text messages shown from June of 2024 in which Celeste texted David, quote, "What if the first abortion didn't work?" She later then expressed regret in going through with the termination, writing, quote, "I would do anything to have it back." That same month, there was a text from David to Celeste that read, quote, "Let's let this abortion be the last one until we have the real one." Then there were messages from January of 2024 in which David was apologizing for, quote, putting her through this, and in which Celeste responded by saying, quote, "It's okay. Neither of us are capable of watching and taking care of the baby. It's for the best, no?" In another message, David then texted Celeste, quote, "My mother always told me to ask this question if I was ever in this situation. It is mine, right?" And Celeste replied with, "Of course it's yours, David." In another exchange, Celeste asked David if anyone knew that they were actively in an intimate physical relationship, to which David responded by saying, quote, "Nope, and I want to keep it that way until we are married." From other messages, it was also confirmed that their relationship, and I hate calling it a relationship because she was a child, but messages showed arguments arguments between them that confirmed that they did break up on numerous different occasions. And the messages showed that Celeste was finding it really hard to be in this quote-unquote relationship because she wanted more out of David that David was not willing to give her. It sounds like her opinion was that David only wanted to be with her for her body and not for who she actually was as a person. In a text during an argument from March of 2025, Celeste texted David saying, quote, "All we do is hang out and have I don't want anything to do with you in person anymore if I'm going to try and move on." And in another one of those conversations, Celeste was upset, and David's way of telling her to relax, I guess, was saying that she was acting like they were going through their first breakup when in reality it was their 8th time breaking up. More messages showed more arguments, and they showed that the relationship was starting to go downhill because their arguments were just getting more and more frequent. But they also did show times in which it seemed like the two of them were in a good place. David telling Celeste that he loved her, talking about getting married in Italy and talking about moving in together, which they referred to as Operation Awesome. And I don't mean to say that they were in a good place because that was not a good place to be in. Celeste should have never been involved with him to begin with. But I'm kind of more seeing it from her point of view, given that she was only 14 years old, and in her head she was maybe thinking that they were in a good place because she couldn't see him for what he really was, which what he really is a horrible person. But anyway, those pictures and texts, by the way, which included over 8,000 text messages, were recovered from his iPhone that was taken during a search of his home. So police detective Corey Farrell was the one who testified in regards to a lot of the photos and a lot of those text messages. And in the entirety of the hearing, the prosecution called 11 witnesses, and the defense did not call any of their own, but they did cross-examine all of the prosecutions. Another person who testified was Dr. Ho. Dr. Grant Ho is a medical examiner at the LA County Medical Examiner's Office. He performed the autopsy and testified about his findings. That was probably one of the heaviest days, if not the heaviest day in the entire hearing, because everything that he had to say was so incredibly devastating and hard to listen to. And I'm about to go through that, and it is graphic and it's not easy to listen to. So if you don't want to listen to that, or if you don't think that you can, I would probably skip this video. He first stated that he couldn't estimate exactly how long Celeste had been deceased for, nor the exact day that her body was dismembered because of how badly decomposed the body was, saying that it was so badly decomposed that some of it had liquefied. He did state, however, that by the time that her remains were found, it was clear that it had been, quote, at least weeks. And prosecutors believe that Celeste was murdered in April of 2025. Her remains were not found until September 8th of 2025. So that would put the gap between the estimated time of death and the discovery of her remains at approximately 4 to 5 months. On the stand, Dr. Grant Ho was asked whether it was possible that she was killed 5 months before her body was found, and he responded with potentially. He also testified that her arms and legs had been removed using some sort of power tool, and he was able to determine that because of how it was done, describing it to be relatively clean, though he stated that the exact tool could not be determined. 2 fingers were also severed, including one that had a tattoo that read David. One of those fingers to this day has still not yet been found. In his 26-page report, he also mentioned that Celeste died of, quote, multiple penetrating injuries that were caused with objects. And he spent a lot of time on the stand describing 2 key injuries, one to the right of her abdomen that pierced her liver and another one to the left of the chest. Throughout his testimony, people in the courtroom were audibly gasping when photos of Celeste were put on the screen. Meanwhile, David remained stoic and showed apparently zero emotion. Celeste's parents were not in the courtroom for a lot of the photos because they simply could not be. And again, that same district attorney that I mentioned earlier kept checking in on them, mouthing to them, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And ultimately suggesting that they leave the courtroom entirely because she thought that no parent should ever have to sit through that. Another big testimony came from a man who acted as David's financial manager, as well as another guy who was the senior vice president of finance at Interscope Records, which is the agency that David was signed with. David's financial manager testified that between 2023 and 2025, David brought in more than $10 million in gross earnings, and the senior vice president testified that David's recording deal was worth somewhere between $13 to $19 million. The prosecution using these testimonies to say, look, he had a lot to lose. He already made millions. He was expected to make a lot more. So you can see why, if and when Celeste threatened to expose the relationship and potentially ruin his career, he would have a motive to want to get rid of her before she had the chance to expose anything at all. Now let's talk about the timeline, okay? So in the days leading up to the murder, David and Celeste had been arguing. They had been texting back and forth, arguing about a female that David had formed a relationship with. Celeste was not happy about this, and she allegedly told him that she no longer wanted to be in a relationship with him if he was going to continue his friendship with this other girl. We don't know who this other girl is, nor do we know her age. At one point during their argument, according to David's attorney, Celeste starts to make multiple violent threats and starts threatening to hurt not only herself, but to hurt David as well. She also allegedly said that she was going to, quote, tell her father lies that would end his music career and damage his life. This argument is going on April 22nd of 2025, and then Celeste begins to repeatedly ask if she could see David in person. The following day, April 23rd, they text back and forth about Celeste going over to David's house in the Hollywood Hills to talk in person. And they start arguing again about the same thing around 5 p.m. It sounds like Celeste was asking David to show her something because David asked her why he has to show her everything. And Celeste responds with, quote, because I had your embryo in me. David then calls her a car for her to come to his house, and to support that, there is allegedly an Uber receipt showing that David did call a ride from her house to his house at around 8:30 p.m. Like I said, their houses were around 80 miles away from each other, so that's a bit of a drive, okay? Celeste texts David at 10:02 p.m., letting him know that she was almost going to arrive at his house. Then at 10:10 p.m., she asks him to open his door. At 10:10 p.m., David responds by saying that the gate was open and his door was unlocked. Prosecutors believe that very shortly after she arrived, he committed the murder. According to the records, it was about 20 minutes after she allegedly arrived that David then texted Celeste asking where she was, but she never responded. He continued sending several messages throughout the night asking where she was, at one point saying, "Bro, you're scaring me." Prosecutors believe that that was his attempt at pretending that she never actually showed up, and they believe that he started the process of disposing of evidence that same night. According to records, David's phone and car location showed that he left his house that night at around 11:30 p.m. to drive to Santa Barbara. Between the day that the murder is believed to have taken place and the day that her body was found, David allegedly drove again to Santa Barbara twice more. And in the hearing, one detective reviewed cell phone records that supported that exact narrative, showing records that David's Tesla drove from his house in Hollywood Hills to Santa Barbara. A California Highway Patrol officer also testified, stating that on January 7th, so this is now months later, he recovered Celeste's passport card from a worker who had found it along the highway. And those records from David's Tesla track with where that passport was found because his Tesla was near the location where the passport card was recovered. So that would make sense that he somehow left the passport along in the route that he was going, in which he would have taken to dispose of the evidence, if that is what he was doing. And then 2 days after the murder is believed to have taken place, on April 25th of 2025, David's first album was released. He threw an album release party at his house, and then he went on tour. So as of yesterday, Monday, July 28th, the judge ruled that there is enough evidence for this case to move forward and go to trial. We don't know when that is yet, but we do know that there is going to be a trial. And if you're listening to this and you're thinking like, there is an overwhelming amount of evidence against him, how in the world is his defense team going to defend him? The unfortunate truth is that we're not going to know until we do know. I don't think that the defense put up their strongest arguments that they may or may not have at the preliminary hearing, because I wouldn't be surprised if there were certain things that they were holding on to until the actual trial. However, what they did do at the preliminary hearing was try to poke holes in every single thing that the prosecution was saying. For example, they questioned how they preserved the crime scene, pointing out that officers were allowed in the house and walked around before the crime scene investigators could get there. When it came to the phone evidence, the text messages, they argued back, asking how it was decided that that was David's phone, hinting at the fact that it could have been Celeste's phone, although I'm not really sure exactly why that would matter. During a cross-examination, they asked an analyst to see if there was a way to say when or how certain DNA might have arrived on a certain item, to which she responded by saying that that was difficult to know for sure. They also really focused in on the fact that Celeste's body was so badly decomposed that medical examiners simply could not have definitive answers as to what exactly happened to her, down to the exact timing of everything. They argued that, yeah, David could have ordered that Uber for Celeste, but that as of now, there are no witnesses that could 100% confirm that she did make it inside of his house that night. Then also pointing out that it was Celeste's idea to want to meet up in person, not David's, and that David only agreed to meet in person after she quote unquote demanded it. And they also made sure to point out certain messages that Celeste sent that showed that her mental state was in a very dark place, and that a lot of the time she was upset or she was angry at David. They went as far as to question that if the injuries that she had, the injuries that caused her death, could have been self-inflicted. I'm not lying. They really brought that up, and unfortunately, as insane and unrealistic and ridiculous as it sounds, it is one of those details that is impossible to test for because of the state that her remains were found in. So I don't know what they're gonna try and pull. I guess we'll see. But this, yeah, it's so disturbing. A lawyer for Celeste's family has said that the family members will not talk publicly about this case, saying, quote, "There are no words to express the indescribable pain that the family is experiencing." But he did say that her family is relieved by the judge's decision to take this case to trial. I don't really know what to say, to be honest with you. That's all for me today. If I missed anything, please leave it down in the comments. And yeah, thank you for spending time with me today. I hope you guys are having the best day. If not, go do something to make it the best day. Make somebody happy, and I will see you in my next video. Massive kiss on the forehead to every single one of you.